I wanted to move on to another discussion, like in a completely different direction, and it's something I feel like that's affected both of you, and it's the issue of free speech. And I was hoping we can talk a bit about it. Like, I want to take your own definitions, both of yours. What do you think free speech is, and do you think free speech is essential in a thriving, rational society, or and obviously, I mean, there's loads of discussions we can have here, but can you just start with that?
And,
So,
and,
if
and one more thing I want to add is that we can make a distinction of free speech in the society and free speech in a university, right? So one more question that I want to add, and you can address, both of you can address that particular question, is that suppose that there is, a person who is known to be controversial, okay, but suppose that he or she is invited to a university. Now, there is a tendency in student unions to have protest against that particular person. Now, what I want to ask is that do you think that there is a distinction that if that particular person is invited to the university to give a commencement speech, or to award him or her an honorary doctorate, and in the particular scenario in which he or she is invited to give any talk that he or she likes, so do you think that both of these scenarios are worthy to be protested against by the students, or do you think that no, there's no distinction between them?
yeah, Pervez, can you start with
Yeah,
your
yeah, sure.
definition first, and then like.
Well, I think speech should be free to the extent possible. I would be very reluctant to stop somebody from speaking in a university, at a graduation, uh, or publishing in a newspaper or speaking on television, unless the consequences of that lead to something terrible, something very bad, or that they contain absolute disinformation. So, somebody who propagates hatred, I would say that I would not give that person the podium. Um, Now, what constitutes hatred? I think we have an understanding that when you say that a particular uh, racial group, ethnic group, or a religious group are evil, and that they must be exterminated, well, I will not give that person the right to speak. Short of that, I think everything else should be allowed. And so, personally, when I see that, let's say, Winston Churchill's statue is pulled down, I feel that although he was an imperialist, he was a bad man, he was a racist, yet, since he is not causing us harm at this present moment, since he's dead and is likely to remain so, um, I would not go along with those who are pulling down statues today. In Pakistan, where I am right now in Islamabad, I know that there is no such thing as free speech, that you're censured at every possible point. And in our universities are dead. They are like morgues of the intellect. You cannot talk about anything in them. And so people have stopped talking. So if I compare the vibrancy of what you might have in France or in the United States or many places in the world, there's no comparison. And the reason they are vibrant and the reason we are dead here in Pakistan is because our threshold of tolerance is so very low. However, I repeat, there's no such thing as absolute free speech. And furthermore, in some cases, it is inadvisable. If you go to a gas station, a petrol pump, and you light a cigarette over there or a match over there, oh, you might say it's my right to do that, but it's not, because you're putting people in danger. And that, of course, there are laws on that, and those laws are correct.
Okay, shall I reply?
Yeah. First of all, would you say you agree with that, or would you define yourself as a free speech absolutist? Because
No. Many comments to make, but I don't like this word absolutist. But you see, I don't know anybody who advocates the elimination of a group for the moment. There are people who advocate wars, for example, the war in Iraq or in Afghanistan and so on, or even threaten wars with Russia and so on, or Iran particularly. That's okay. I mean, those guys have complete free speech, they have access to mainstream media, etc. So of course I challenge this idea that there are horrible opinions, because to me these are the most horrible opinions in our society, and they have complete access to the mainstream media. So let's forget about horrible opinions. But my view of free speech is simply that the state should not prevent the individual to say what he thinks. Okay, the individual. Now, whether the state, for example, controls the mainstream media, it depends how it does it. But there might be a good argument to be made that the state should control more the mainstream media in order to have balance. Okay, in my youth, for example, when there were only public TV, I remember there are debates between all the parties in parliament or something like that, and there was this still, even these so-called these bad state-controlled media are actually more balanced than now that we have all these private media all over the place. I repeat all the same thing, and they're always the same people who are invited, and it's not as balanced as it could be. But you see the issue, but of course, that's not censorship, because these people are not expressing private views. They are in media that have access to millions of people, that have certain airwaves, etc., etc. And whether these things are regulated, that's I not object to. I may object to the way it's regulated, but not the principle. On the other hand, if somebody sends a letter to a newspaper, which is what Forisson did, denying certain things about the war, what happened during the war, then he was sued, and that's how I got involved in that, not because of him, but because of Chomsky. This to me was a clear-cut case where it was an attack on free speech. And in fact, the courts in the beginning said that what he said was more or less okay, and they didn't condemn him for that, but for other details. And in the end, they made a special law in order for him to be condemned, which I thought was an utter absurdity, and I could go on and on about that. But you see, I distinguish between private opinions and then the question of freedom of the media, which is a complicated thing, because the media in the West, at least, and probably in Pakistan too, is extremely unilateral. It's extreme. For example, all the liberal American media have repeated this business about Russiagate, for which there is no evidence. The French media, almost all of them, except Le Monde Diplomatique, have been repeating this business about the Russiagate, and there is no way to have another voice being heard of, and that has been going on for years. That's just the latest example. I could give many other examples, like the run-up to the Iraq War or something like that. And so that's, of course, my concern. So in that sense, I don't know if I'm absolutely, I don't think I'm an absolutist about anything. But you have to see, of course, I want to compare the situation in Pakistan. I know it's worse in Pakistan, but you have to see how far the limit to free speech go in the West. You probably know that Dawkins has been cancelled, in the cancel culture, from a speech in Dublin, in Ireland, where he was supposed to speak, and he was cancelled because he had made some remark on Twitter comparing different sex crimes and saying some are more important than others, and that you're not even supposed to say. I don't know why, but you can't say that. And because if you say, crime A is worse than crime B, then you're saying crime B is okay after all, which is not what he was saying, but it's interpreted like that. And then also because of his opposition to Islam, which I found funny, because last time I checked, I thought Ireland was a Catholic country, but like my university, they've changed so much that now you can't criticize Islam in Ireland. So that's an extreme example of the cancel culture about Dawkins, which we all know. But then I would give the example of somebody much less relevant and much more unimportant, namely myself. I was very surprised, and I could give many other examples besides me, and I give some of them in my book. But since I know my own case, I can describe it in detail. I was invited to give a talk on quantum mechanics, and my view on quantum mechanics was not the problem in Nice, in the south of France last year. And when I arrived, I learned that the talk was cancelled because of my views on free speech. So even if I'd been somebody, his problem is that it's all far right, but why is it far right to defend free speech? Last time I looked, Hitler, Mussolini, and so on were not for free speech. I mean, what is this? Why is it become Freiheit? It has become Freiheit because there's this pseudo left which has managed to create this cancel culture where they constantly attack people, including physically. I've been threatened physically. I've got death threats for defending free speech. Okay, from people who are supporting a state in the Middle East, which I won't mention. But then it's just that craziness, and that's supposed to be on the left, which is a complete inversion of values. Anyway, so they said you can't give a talk on quantum mechanics because somebody totally outside the university had sent an alert to them saying, "Oh, but he defends free speech." Well, what was the issue? That's a French comedian, which is actually half black and half French, half from Cameroon and from France, Dieudonné, who has been extremely controversial because of anti-Semitism, of course. So I won't go into the whole story, but during a TV broadcast, which made me totally banned from everything afterwards, I simply say that people want to see him, they should be allowed to see him, that's all. In fact, he's still performing, so people can still see him. So it can't be the end of the world if he has these shows. But because of that, they said we can't speak about quantum mechanics. Now, if I go to Pakistan, which is a much more repressive state, and if I tell people I don't believe in God, I think they will still let me speak about physics. If I go to China, they let me speak about physics. In many countries, and these liberal human rights, free speech France, where people are gung-ho about free speech when it comes to insulting the Muslim, having this caricature of the prophet, which I think are extremely silly, then free speech is absolute. In France, they're absolutists when it comes to that. But if somebody like me defends free speech for other people, then you can't even speak about physics. I'm not talking about even a political talk. I've been banned from political talk before, again, only because of these views on free speech. For example, my views on imperialism are not that controversial, even though they are marginal too. But free speech is supposed to be the most extreme double standards that you can think of. On the one hand, there is almost a duty to insult Muslim from morning to evening, and on the other hand, if you defend free speech or people who are accused of anti-Semitism without even discussing it, then you are a non-person. That's extraordinary.
Actually, I wanted to confirm this particular statement that you made. So I would want to ask this from Dr. Hoodbhoy that is it true that if there is some controversial figure who has some very controversial views on, for example, religion or politics, then he or she will be allowed to give a talk on physics without any problem? Is that correct or not?
Look,
As a foreigner.
Yeah, okay, as a foreigner.
I just lost my job 3 months ago.
No, that's true. That's true. That's true.
Earlier, I lost my job 8 years ago. And most universities in Pakistan will not allow me to set foot on their campuses. It's not that I say anything radical. I'm simply saying keep religion and science apart from each other. It's, it's bad for religion, it's bad for science. Just let them be in two non-overlapping spheres. That's Stephen Jay Gould argument. Not that I am possessed by that argument, but it's a safe argument to make, or at least it should be safe. But for that reason, I am considered controversial. Now, nobody in the West would think I'm controversial on that.
No, of course.
Nobody. It's just plain common sense. It's plain common sense that you shouldn't have to say that you can derive predictions from the Quran. You can't. It's obvious that you can't. And I say it's obvious that you can't. It's not a book of science. But then that puts me as being anti-Muslim. And so look, I've spent a long time here. It's my 50th year, in the 47th actually, teaching. And now the society has become so intolerant that I just don't know where I'll go from here.
But can you teach at all now, or you don't teach at? What do? You don't teach, or what do you do?
Well, I don't know. I might go to China. I might go to somewhere. They've just shut me up. I'm in my room. I write my papers. Do my research, but that's it. Totally marginalized.
And you're not paid then by university or anything?
No university. I taught for free, unpaid, at Qaid-e-Azam University, where I taught for 42 years, and then actually I taught for 47. And the last 10 years have been unpaid. All I wanted was a little room for myself, that same room that I had since the time I came as a lecturer. And just now they threw me out. Okay, too bad.
No, I think this is absolutely terrible, and I don't want to compare the situation with the situation here. But you see, first of all, when I said I would not, as a foreigner, I would probably be allowed to speak, not about religion, but about physics. Because you are banned about physics because they want to punish you for your views on religion. But okay, I was saying as a foreigner. In France, I'm a foreigner. And what I'm saying is that, you see, to me, there's an enormous deterioration of the free speech that we had in the West, including in the United States. The cancel culture has an extreme intimidation effect. You must also realize that if, for example, I mentioned this professor in my university, which is nominally Catholic, was kicked out. He was not he is not permanent position, but his temporary position was not renewed because he dared to criticize abortion. So now anybody who would be a social conservative would be worried about saying anything in that university on any other issue, gay marriage or whatever. And of course, people who would be like me, skeptical of war propaganda, at least when the wars occur, that would be totally impossible to express those views if I'm not, you don't have a permanent position. So although it's not comparable to Pakistan, it's much worse than it used to be here, and I don't see anything gained either from here or there by this worsening of the situation here. And it's really, the situation is really, the double standards are so glaring that it's really, very worrying, because now you have heard this terrible, absolutely horrible story of this professor who had been decapitated by a Chechen, Muslim, of course, because of the caricature of the Prophet. But the problem with this caricature of the Prophet, of course, I don't deny that you are free to show them, but the problem is that it's insistent that they make it into the whole point of secularism in France to show these caricatures. And these people will say you have to show them in every school. That's exactly the wrong thing to do. Let them, leave them aside. Discuss religion. I mean, all these caricatures don't move an inch in the discussion about religion because they just insult people. They say, yeah, look, you're idiotic, and I show you a prophet with something naked and something in the ass, etc. Ha ha ha. I mean, this is the most absurd, the most ridiculous attitude. Of course, I'm not saying they are not free. Of course, they shouldn't be killed for that. That's of course horrible. But the point is that now, because people have been killed about that, the reaction of those people who claim to be secular is to insist that we should keep on showing these pictures all over the place, which is absurd. It was a mistake in the first place. It was an absurd attitude in the first place. And the fact that people died for that doesn't make it right, because we need to discuss with Muslims. Of course, I agree, Pervez is going to say that's very difficult to discuss with those fanatics. But of course, in France, at least, or in Belgium, not everybody is a fanatic. I discuss with religious people. With
Look, I agree with you that it was stupid, but I'll go beyond that and say that, come back to what I was saying earlier, nobody has the right to light a match at a petrol pump or a gas station because it puts everybody in danger. And so, would I stop that school teacher from showing those caricatures? Yes, I would have stopped that teacher. So I am most definitely not an absolutist. I do believe that there are limits of human civilized behavior. So although he is perfectly at liberty to show those caricatures to his friends, to his girlfriend, to his parents or whatever, but he is not at liberty to show them to those who would be offended, and then those who would react in such a violent way as they did. And so provoking people is not a good way of trying to convince them of an alternative truth.
We completely agree. But I wouldn't even dare go as far as you do, although in my heart I may agree with you because I live here. And what happened with this professor, he wasn't killed immediately. There were protests and there were parents protesting, etc. And, the state, there's some regulation of the education. They were considering, blaming him or taking sanctions against him because of that. So the state was not really whole behind him. But now, because he has been killed by this terrorist, then of course now people are criticizing, all the secular people are criticizing the state for having considered blaming him. You say, oh, you yell to the Islamists, and you know how it is. It's just war hysteria. So now there's all this secularism, instead of saying that, oh, this thing was silly from the first thing, and Charlie Hebdo is silly, and it's disgusting, and it's absurd. I mean, Charlie Hebdo is a neoconservative journal. You have to understand that it used to be a sort of anarchist, in the time of de Gaulle, it was sort of 68, vague anarchist, satirical journal, etc. But then it stopped. And then it started again in the 90s, and it was directed by somebody who was a neoconservative. And that's what their line has been, to try to, put fuel on the fire of the conflict between Muslim and non-Muslim, which I think is atrocious. And of course, if you try saying something about the Middle East, then again, they're of course they are not open to jokes. That's the least you can say. But so, I mean, I would agree with you, except it's totally impractical to say we should censor this thing, because now, former Prime Minister of France say we should show them in every school, and when the schools start again, they have to be shown in every class, in every school. And it's just absurd. They
I
want
hope.
to Huh?
Is that what is actually being said? That you must show them in school?
Not by everybody, but by Valls, was a former prime minister. Yes, yes. I mean, former prime minister under Hollande. Yes, the left on the left. I mean, that shows you how far the left is. No, because they say, well, we should not. You see, the whole argument that we should not yell to the Islamists. So if you don't spit on the face of every Muslim kid of 14-year-old, you are yelling to the Islamists. That's the mentality. It's like a holy war. We have own, we have own imams, and we have own ayatollahs, and we have our own holy war, except it's done in the name of human rights, secularism, and so on. It's totally confusing.
This is a way of producing more Islamists, producing more crazies, more murderers.
Of course. I agree. No, I agree with that. But I agree. No, would I ban the? Yeah, I would probably, because you see, again, it's like free speech. If I teach physics, and during my physics course I defend astrology, then of course this is not covered by free speech, because I'm paid to teach physics, not astrology. It's as simple as that. Of course, in Pakistan, maybe it's a bit difficult if you want to ban people from teaching you how the earth and the heaven move and so on, because it has become mainstream. But of course, I would, within of course reasonable grounds, I would ban physicists who tell nonsense. I might allow people to speak about the many worlds, interpretations, because I'm very tolerant, but still, I would certainly put limits like teaching astrology. So, I mean, the professor in the class is supposed to teach something, and it was, of course, a lecture on free speech.
Oh, by the way, in our discussion on quantum mechanics, we missed out on multiverses, but now I see what you are.
You should see me and John argue, because I defend many worlds, and it's always like.
Let's not go back to that. Let's stick to this issue of secularism.
Jean, if I can interfere for a second, and especially for Pervez. So the discussion we're having right now, I can imagine it can be a bit sensitive. So let us know if you want us to cut something out.
Okay.
Yeah.
I am. Please don't cut anything out, except it becomes too long.
Sure.
And indeed, it has become a bit too long. But look, there is nothing that I have said which I would take back. In fact, I say many things which people find provocative, but which are, they're so obvious. Like, we must have democracy.
Mhm.
That democracy cannot be had if the army is ruling the country. That the army should go back to the barracks. It should not own huge amounts of property. The army retired personnel should not head corporations. They should not be given preference in jobs as they are being given. If you look in Pakistan, all the important positions, except for a few, are taken up by retired army officers. This is something wrong. And so when I wrote about this last week in a major newspaper over here, there was it was the most commented article, and then I got the hate mail. So much hate mail that I just kept deleting it from my inbox. I have no social media. I do not use Twitter. I do not use Facebook. And in spite of that, the amount of hate mail that this obvious thing, which nobody who is sane would ever think as worthy of comment, yet is flooded with comments on that. So actually, we live in slightly different worlds. That which is in the West and which has gone through a longer period of civilization, and we who have to go through a lot more. So all the struggles that you had, Jean, in the time of the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment and then the scientific revolutions, I'm not sure that we're going to go through all that. Maybe it'll get very compressed because of the internet and the free flow of information. But we are nowhere close to that.
No, I agree. The situation in Pakistan is very different from the situation here. I completely agree. And I think your position is extremely courageous. I admire it greatly. But let's still try to disagree on something. I don't agree with Gould, with the, and I think you probably will agree with me philosophically on that. And it also explains why, in a sense, and it's a remark by Steven Weinberg, that the fundamentalist religious people are more coherent than the liberal ones. Because you see, if you say that religion doesn't have anything to do with matter of facts, they have claimed for centuries things that were matter of facts. Christians believe in the literacy of the Bible. The Jews believe in the literacy in the Bible. The creation in 7 days, the miracles, everything, Jesus walking on water and blah, blah, blah. And of course, the Muslims have their own statements of facts, okay? So take away all statements of facts. Then what is
What I'm
left?
saying is it gives you safety.
Sorry?
All I'm saying is that it gives one safety, at least in circumstances similar to mine.
Sure. No, I'm doing philosophy here. I'm not discussing politics. Politically, I completely understand. Okay, but let's try to understand the point of view of the Islamist. Okay, I'm going to be devil's argument from the point of view of the Islamists because I've had this discussion with fundamentalist Christians. Of course, are nowhere as important as Islamists in Pakistan, of course. But here they would say, if you give up all the statement of facts, then what is left? Well, there are statements that are, let's say, statement of facts, but are totally unverifiable or untestable, like the existence of God, the life after death, and so on and so forth. These are, of course, things which you can say, well, it's not science, although scientifically minded people will reject it. And then there are these moral values. But what moral values? Why would these people get it right when it comes to moral values if get everything wrong about facts? And that's why, it's not so easy to get the religious people to accept the Norma, because they realize they are being, sell, what do you call that, a bill of goods or something. I mean, it's something, they are going to be tricked. Because if you accept the Norma from the religious point of view, then what's the next step is to say, okay, what's your basis for your moral judgments? If you're factual, if you get it wrong, everything, if you hold your Bible, let's stick to the Christian or Jewish religion, the Bible is full of fake news, then why should your ethics be correct? There's no basis for that.
Yeah, it's an old problem, and it's one that Muslim modernists on the subcontinent faced. Once the colonialists came, they brought with them modern science, and modern science worked very well. It gave you the telegraph, it gave you the steam engine, and it told you that the world ran on physical principles. So when they saw all these things working, a few Muslim modernists then finally emerged from this. They picked up the courage and they said, okay, if we look at the Quran, we see it has got many miracles, but now maybe they're not really miracles. Maybe it's that we didn't understand the Arabic well enough. That was one way of going about it. Then they said, well, even if we do understand the Arabic well enough and there's a contradiction, well, then let's believe the science, because God spoke in allegorical terms. So there was an escape route that they sought in that way. There's a man called Sayyid Ahmad Khan, who was actually bold enough to say that these miracles didn't actually happen. Well, those were good times. That's nearly 200 years ago that he was able to say that. Today, his fate would have been that of that French teacher who lost his. Yeah.
Even in that time, there were, I think you have already told that there were more than 555 fatwas against him when he said that.
5,555.
5,000. Okay.
Wow. As we wrap it up, I was hoping we can quickly gloss over one topic, and I've seen because I've seen this talk by you, Pervez. It was on Allama Iqbal. So John, Allama Iqbal is a very famous. Well, actually, I'll let Pervez describe who Allama Iqbal is and the significance of it to Pakistan. But the thing that I wanted to discuss was people. So the technical term is bullshit, where people take some sort of language, like scientific language, and they use it to talk about things that are not related to each other, right? We see this in quantum woo all the time, people like Deepak Chopra. So I was hoping, like, maybe, Pervez, you can talk about the thing with Allama Iqbal and his misuse of physics to describe whatever his philosophical inclinations were. And John, maybe you can contrast that with, like, the kind of work you've done on Jacques Leconte, right? Like how he uses concepts, mathematical concepts to talk about section.
Can I just get the word correct? I didn't know. Islamic what? What was it? The word you said? You want him to comment on something which I didn't know, didn't understand what the word is.
Allama Iqbal. So he was a Pakistani philosopher.
Okay. It's a name of a person.
Died long before Pakistan.
Yeah, it died
Died in
Pakistan.
19.
Actually, I can add the in his question, in Nabzu's question, I can add the thing that Allama Iqbal actually wrote in his book about infinite series and about infinity, and that particular sentence actually doesn't make any sense, but people still defend his description of infinity and infinity.
And he's a contemporary thinker. He's still alive?
No. He died before. Yeah.
If you go to any government office today in Pakistan, you will see three portraits. There is the President of Pakistan. It's a very small one. That portrait is about this much. Then there's a big one of Mr. Jinnah, who's the founder of Pakistan. And next to him, you will see the portrait of this gentleman, whose name is Muhammad Iqbal. And honorifically, he is called the learned one, that is Allama Iqbal. Now, the reason is that he is just a fantastic poet. I mean, there's no poet, except for one maybe, Ghalib, who can compete with him in terms of the sheer control over the language, in terms of his just brilliance as a poet. And so he's got everyone terrified and unable to ask any substantive question, because he overawes everyone. Now, I've been looking at his writings, and in particular, what he has had to say about physics. So, just to let you know, he went to Cambridge to study philosophy in the year 1905. In the year 1908, a year before that, 1907, he went to Germany. He got his PhD in philosophy from the University of Munich. And then he came back, and when he came back, he was an Islamist. So you see, it has happened earlier. It hasn't just happened in Europe. This is a much earlier time. And Iqbal, when he came back, he started writing against reason, rationality, against Western science itself. And so, in this very dense book that he has, it's called Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam. He makes comments about Islam and science and modern science and the contradictions it has within itself. So, as Hassan was saying, he makes a lot of boo-boos in that. And people have they've reverentially read what he has been saying without ever questioning what it is he's been talking about. And so this is the talk that you were referring to. Anyway, I'll stop you.
Yeah. My point was, so he uses physics language, concepts in physics to talk about things that are not physical. Like if I recall, so my Urdu isn't that great, but like if I recall from your talk, you talked about how he thought like general relativity had ended materialism or something along those lines, right? And
and now I remember. He also said that Muslims discovered general relativity much before Einstein did.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, is it correct?
Yeah, it's correct.
So when
He said that. No. He said that. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that they discovered it.
no, but my point with that is essentially, do you think he was influenced by? So from what I don't know any personally, I don't know much about these things, but like, was he influenced by idealism? Because that's the kind of notion that I get from him. Like he was influenced by people like Friedrich Nietzsche, and like the idealist movement in Germany at that time to come out, because they were kind of saying the same things, right? The idealists were saying the same thing, like consciousness is what's like fundamental, materialism has been destroyed. So, they refer to quantum mechanics and all that. Maybe John can talk more about this. He knows much more than I do. But would you say that was his motivation as well? Because I mean, you did say he went to Germany, so maybe his influence was idealism and not necessarily like anti.
No. It wasn't philosophical. It was cultural. He felt himself at a great disadvantage because here he was as a colonial subject. He was looked down upon, and this is a man of great capability. So it was then a natural reaction against the West, which he saw as imperialist, correctly. But then the kind of reaction that he developed against the West was, in my opinion, very unhealthy. And it's the kind of reaction that you have many young people developing because they don't see how the West has led us towards what I think is good. It has led us towards a greater comprehension of the universe, led us towards humanism, which I believe in, which I think is good, but they chose to look at the colonial aspect that the British, the Germans were occupying colonial powers. And that's what hit him in the heart. And then he looked around and he saw Nietzsche and he saw idealists and all that.
Okay.
And actually, there's one more thing that I want to add that I think I remember it from your talk that later in his life, he said doing philosophy as his mistake, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's correct.
And I wish I'd become a preacher.
Well, so
Yeah,
I kind of wanted to parallel that with something that Dr. Bricmont has written, and it's about like this movement, essentially in France, of a group of intellectuals that came forward, and they kind of denied science as well, saying that it has like fundamentally it's flawed, or materialism is wrong, and they had like these idealistic bases. So maybe Jean, you can talk a bit about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, okay, I don't want to discuss too much the quotes in our book by Lacan and so on, because somewhat different subject, but it's true that there's been, as I say, there's this link between idealism and relativism. You see, I usually say relativism is idealism plus decolonization. Namely, idealism could speak of a universal mind, etc. But then throughout the 19th, 20th century, people realized that there were different worldviews, etc. And then, because everything depends on your worldview and the world doesn't matter, then of course you get into this relativistic framework. And of course it exists everywhere. You see, at lunch today, I was discussing with friends who are very close to Latin America, and we are discussing the results of the election in Bolivia, which I'm happy with. But the point is that I mentioned that there were Paris-trained intellectuals there who came back to Bolivia, and then they also, they were maybe close to Morales and so on, but they also had this view that Newton's law is a Western contract and blah, blah, blah. So that it exists even in, everywhere. And I think one of the problem in France is that indeed there is this, this relativistic, the left, to the extent that, you see there is this secular fanaticism that I mentioned about, we have to show the prophet, humiliate him and so on. That's one trend. Then the people who defend or think to defend the Muslims do it on a relativist view often. You see, everybody has his worldview, etc. So it's really a disaster. In fact, the disaster is that people who were, let's say, I don't know what you think of him, but at least I know him not very well. Is Nehru in India. He was suddenly put in jail by the British, but when you read the book, which I did read, I was in India and I bought that book, which is called Letter to My Daughter, to Indira Gandhi, is the letters are totally Western. In the sense that they are pro, and he said that the dams were he called it the temples of India. And if you look at India now, it has regressed enormously from that point of view, because now, of course, the leaders are, Islamist, if you wish, except they're Hinduist, and it's the same thing. The problem is that the revolt against the colonialism was made by people who are in the main nationalists, communists, and so on, were in fact relatively secular. Ho Chi Minh, for example, proclaimed independence of Vietnam on the basis of the Independence Declaration of the United States. People forget these things. And then, of course, now we have this secular nationalist or leftist movement has been defeated to a large extent, because at least in the Arab world, because of the imperialists. And now, of course, what comes instead of that is not that everybody is becoming a nice human rights Western liberal, because that doesn't exist. It's impossible. What takes place of that is religious fundamentalism, and that's an absolute disaster. But it's to some extent due to our previous policies, and plus the help, the intellectual help from the fake left here, who then thinks that what they have to do is to defend relativism.
Okay.
Yes,
So
but secular humanism is the way to go. I would believe that although we are seeing setbacks in India in particular, Nehru, as you said, was a very secular man. India now is regressing into nativism, into going back to Hindutva, which is full of animosity, hatred for any who do not belong to the soil as they see it. We have regressed, but the future of humanity, to my mind, lies in secular humanism.
I think that's a good note to end it on.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks to both of you, for spending so much time with us and actually having this discussion. It was quite engaging, from quantum mechanics to relativism to free speech and everything in between. Like, I think I learned a lot, and I'm sure the listeners will as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks. It was lovely to meet
Okay,
you,
thank you. Yeah,
Pervez.
thank you.
Thank
Okay,
you.
good night, everyone.
Thank
And
you.
it was a pleasure to meet you, Jean.
It was a pleasure to
Yeah,
meet you, and
it was pleasure to meet you too,
very
John.
much your struggle there.
Okay.
Yeah, so bye-bye.
Okay, thanks a lot for your time,
Bye.
all of you.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.